et personne ne peut raconter notre histoire.
And no one can tell our story better than we can. For a long time, they were the ones who said what they wanted about Africa.
For years, farmers across Burkina Faso worked hard, yet remained trapped in an agricultural system that belonged to another era. They produced food, but with tools that could no longer support a growing nation. Meanwhile, the country continued importing food it could have grown itself. People living through this contradiction knew something was wrong, but their concerns were rarely heard. Eventually, the frustration reached its limit. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped into power, he didn't begin with theories or abstract policy discussions. He began with conversations, real ones, under trees on the edges of fields, and in the same villages that had been forgotten for decades. From these raw conversations came a single, powerful decision. Burkina Faso would stop depending on others for the food on its table. The only question was whether the country could truly pull it off. Travel into rural Burkina Faso at dawn, and you'll witness a reality that outsiders rarely talk about. Before the heat rises, before the markets open, the countryside is already awake. Farmers move with a rhythm passed down for generations. Children carry water, women prepare tools, older men walk toward their plots with the calm confidence of people who have lived the same morning thousands of times. And that's why the old reality was so difficult to understand. How could a nation full of farmers still end up importing more than 200,000 tons of rice every year? How could people who spent their entire lives producing food watch their markets fill with foreign goods? It wasn't because farmers lacked skill or effort. Everyone knew that. The truth was simple. The system around them wasn't built to help them succeed. Years of neglect had piled up. Farmers had little access to machinery, limited credit, poor storage, and policies designed without rural voices at the table. Farmers were not invisible, they were simply pushed to the sidelines. Governments came and went, each promising reforms, but the changes remained shallow. A pilot project here, a short-lived program there, and then everything faded into silence. Meanwhile, the gap between what the country could produce and what it actually produced kept widening. By the time Traoré rose to leadership in 2023, farmers no longer wanted promises. They wanted someone who understood their daily reality. And to his credit, Traoré started there. He didn't arrive with an entourage expecting applause. He walked through fields, touched dry soil, and listened to problems that had been repeated for decades. Some farmers didn't even bother complaining at first. They had told their stories so many times that they no longer believed anyone cared. But slowly, as they saw he wasn't in a hurry, they opened up. They explained the tools they couldn't afford, the crops they couldn't preserve, the seasons they couldn't predict, and the land they couldn't cultivate fully. They talked about income losses when seeds failed, about sickness caused by pesticides, and about the frustration of producing twice the effort for half the result. Those conversations sparked a shift, not dramatic but deeply practical. The agricultural transformation didn't come from a consultant's report. It came from a population tired of working without results. The country wasn't asking for miracles. It was asking for basic tools, basic support, and basic respect. Traoré treated farmers not as beneficiaries of aid but as architects of their own solutions. He recognized a truth many leaders overlooked. People who work the land every day know more about agriculture than any expert in an office. Once the government embraced that reality, everything changed. Instead of symbolic support, the administration created something substantial. 78 billion CFA francs dedicated specifically to agricultural equipment. Not equipment that sits in warehouses, but machinery delivered directly into the hands of farmers. Tractors, plows, seeders, tillers, and fertilizers, tools that had been discussed for years but never truly delivered. Past programs failed because support was temporary. Machinery didn't match local conditions, funding ran out, and training was insufficient. Farmers learned to expect short-term boosts followed by long-term disappointment. This time things were different. Agricultural engineers were relocated from city offices to rural zones. They weren't distant advisors visiting occasionally, they were present every day. Issues that once took weeks to fix were now handled within hours. Farmers felt supported, not supervised. The results came quickly. Yields increased by 35 to 40%. Fields that once barely produced enough for a family began generating surpluses. For the first time in years, families experienced harvest seasons without fear of shortages. The success wasn't only in the numbers, It was in a renewed mindset. Villagers who had stopped believing in change began expanding their fields, experimenting with new crops and planting community gardens. But what made this transformation more remarkable was the context. Burkina Faso achieved these gains while facing insecurity, displacement, and ongoing threats from armed groups. Under normal circumstances, such challenges crush agricultural output. Instead, Burkina Faso experienced back-to-back years of grain surpluses. The reason was simple. The country didn't treat insecurity and agriculture as separate issues. It viewed them as parts of the same challenge. When attacks intensified and villages were displaced, the government didn't retreat. It reorganized. Farming zones were shifted, production concentrated in safer corridors, and mechanization became a protective tool. Work that once took days could now be done in hours, reducing exposure to risk. Technology also played a key role. Under the AES alliance, intelligence sharing improved. Drones monitored militant movements and flagged dangerous routes. Farmers didn't receive daily reports, but they felt the increased safety on the ground. Movements were more predictable, and dangerous areas were clearly identified. Another important factor was the integration of displaced people into the agricultural system. Instead of leaving them in camps with nothing to do, the government aimed to create 100,000 agricultural jobs for displaced citizens: land clearing, irrigation work, basic processing, storage, and more. This approach strengthened food production while reducing the number of young men vulnerable to insurgent recruitment. Fields once abandoned were cultivated again. Community cooperation increased. Farmers saw that growing food wasn't only about feeding families, it was about stabilizing the nation. Many people felt this movement carried the spirit of Thomas Sankara. When Burkinabe discuss the agricultural offensive today, they rarely compare it to recent governments. Their minds go back to the 1980s, to Sankara's era of self-reliance. Sankara believed that a country fed by outsiders could never be truly independent. Under him, Burkina Faso briefly achieved food self-sufficiency in 1987. When he was assassinated, the country slowly drifted back toward dependency. Imported seeds replaced local ones, export crops replaced food crops, and the system became distant once again. So when Traoré revived the dream of food sovereignty, people didn't see it as something new. They saw it as a return to a path the country was meant to follow. The tools are modern: drones, tractors, nationalized gold revenue, but the philosophy is the same. A nation must take responsibility for its own survival. To understand the real impact of the agricultural offensive, look at how daily life has changed. Before mechanization, land preparation took days, planting took weeks, and delays could ruin an entire season. Mechanization didn't eliminate hard work, but it changed what was possible. A task that previously took a week could now be completed in an afternoon. Even small shifts in timing could mean the difference between a failed harvest and a successful one. The government avoided a one-size-fits-all model. Small farms received plows, draft animals, and practical tools they could maintain. Larger farms and cooperatives received tractors, seeders, and tillers. Over 400 tractors have already been distributed, with more than 600 on the way. This is something Burkina Faso never had before: true national capacity for mechanized agriculture. Training became part of the strategy. Engineers in rural areas taught farmers how to use and maintain equipment. This prevented machinery from sitting idle and created long-term habits rather than dependency. Villages began transforming. Fields became more organized, land was used more efficiently, and stress around planting seasons decreased. Farmers now saw expansion, not survival, as a realistic goal. But growing food is only half of sovereignty. Processing it is the other half. For decades, Burkina Faso lost value because crops were sold raw. Tomatoes rotted before reaching markets, mangoes sold cheaply due to lack of drying facilities, and grains that could be milled locally were exported in raw form. The new strategy is changing that. The community-owned tomato factory in Bobo Dioulasso is a model for the future. 80% funded by citizens through APEC, it buys local tomatoes, employs local workers, and keeps value within the country. When farmers know their crops won't rot, they plant more confidently and invest more boldly. The government plans similar factories for rice, potatoes, mangoes, flour, and poultry feed. The goal isn't massive industrial complexes but medium-sized processing units that communities can run themselves. This shift is psychological as much as economic. When farmers deliver produce to a factory partly owned by their community, they see agriculture not as survival, but as participation in a national economy. Confidence grows, ambition grows, value is finally staying inside Burkina Faso. And now a bigger question emerges. If one of the poorest nations in the world can transform its agricultural system so deeply, what does that mean for the rest of West Africa? And how far can this shift go? Let us know what you think in the comments.